Greetings, everyone. We're delighted to have all of you here today joining our EWS 101 webinar. Thank you for posting your information in our Introductions chat pod. Please introduce yourself sharing your role and your organization, and the webinar is now going to begin.
Hello, and welcome to the learning series on early warning systems, supported by the Regional Educational Laboratory System at IE at the Institute for Educational Sciences. I'm Sarah Frazelle, and with me today are experienced researchers and practitioners who will share their ideas and stories on implementing early warning systems. There will be more events offered throughout the year across the United States, some in webinar format, some face-to-face, and some provided through infographics. It's important to us that this series resonates with you and the environment that you operate in. Your feedback will be a primary resource in the development of our upcoming Learning Series events. The Regional Educational Laboratory System, or RELs, work in partnership with schools, districts, state departments of education, and others to use data and research to improve academic outcomes for students. Fundamentally, the mission of the RELs is to provide support for a more evidence-reliant education system. Throughout today's webinar, we will help you gain a basic understanding of the 5 key components of a high-leverage early warning system. These elements include building a team, identifying appropriate indicators, creating data reports, mapping interventions to indicators, and evaluating those interventions. Early warning systems combine the use of data and structured teams to proactively identify struggling students. They can be a powerful tool to address disparities among student groups and strategically develop supports to help all students graduate on time and with their peers. In case you're eager for more information after this webinar, we've provided a couple of resources for your reading enjoyment. The American Institutes for Research produced the first implementation guide in 2013. The guide includes a 7-step process that guides users in making informed decisions about how to support at-risk students and continue to monitor their progress over time. Another resource is a practitioner's guide to implementing early warning systems, developed by REL Northwest and published in 2015. The guide is based off of a national scan of literature describing successful strategies for implementation used by early warning system teams across the United States. The guide is broken up into 5 main areas, similar to this webinar. We have establishing teams, indicators and reports, which are separate sections in the guide, linking indicators with interventions, and evaluating those interventions. Today we will provide an overview of each section and give you some time to engage in some of these areas and processes. Today we are fortunate to have presenters who speak from their experience in implementing early warning systems. Our first 2 presenters are Denise Scala and Amy Szymanski. Jenny Scala is a senior researcher for the American Institutes for Research. She is the project manager of AIR's Early Warning System service line and has been providing technical assistance to educators for over 15 years. Jenny has worked on projects focused on dropout prevention in rural states and districts, as well as in urban districts. She has served as a researcher on multiple REL studies for REL West and REL Northeast and Islands, including early warning systems, indicator validation, developing tools for an EWS, and implementation. Using her experience, Jenny participates in assisting states, districts, schools, and other parties to create and strategically implement early warning systems. Our other presenter is Amy Szymanski. Amy Szymanski has over 20 years of experience in the field of education, primarily in the areas of special education. Szymanski currently works as a statewide secondary transition and workforce development consultant with the state support team in Region 1 in Ohio. She is well informed in the areas of secondary transition for students with disabilities and dropout prevention and has presented on these topics at local, state, and national levels. Szymanski recently served as a technical assistance consultant in the education program at AIR. And now I will turn this over to Jenny.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And so I'm going to start off by talking about 3 of those 5 categories that Sarah just gave an overview on. And the first one is going to be on establishing an early warning system team. And really the goals of this section, and we'll talk more about these throughout our conversation today, are making sure that you've got the right people on your early warning system team, which includes making sure that there are clear roles and responsibilities, as well as making sure that there's a realistic or appropriate goal for your early warning system team. And then it's important for all of your team members to also have an understanding of some of the indicators, and particularly what is a valid early warning indicator, and then wanting to make sure that others who are going to interact with your early warning system team have professional development so that they know enough about early warning systems so that they're seen as a resource and as an expert within the school as this early warning system work is going on. So really focusing in just specifically on this notion of creating an early warning system team. And I first want to say that Sarah had alluded to the fact that there are going to be a series of these webinars as we move forward throughout this year. And one of them is going to talk explicitly around how early warning systems connect with other multi-tiered systems of support or frameworks. And so one of the questions that we really get a lot of times is, do we need to have a separate early warning system team? And what we say is, as you're building your team, you want to make sure that you have the right person on the team, the right people on the team. And those would include team members who have the authority to make decisions. We know from our research and from our experience that it can be really frustrating for teams to do great work but then not have that authority to really implement changes or to make some decisions and see those decisions through. So making sure that there's a member on the team who has the authority to make those decisions. You also want to make sure that your team has knowledge of diverse students that are reflective of your student population in your school. You also want to make sure that you've got someone on your team that can talk about the available range of interventions. Then that doesn't mean that your team is just going to be comprised of people who provide these additional supports and interventions, but you do need to have that perspective of what interventions are available. And we're going to be talking a lot about different types of data that you're going to be having through your early warning system. So you're going to want to make sure that you have expertise in your early warning system team on managing and analyzing data. And that can also include student information system, which is the last bullet under this section, because you're going to likely need to get information and data from your student information system. So you're going to need someone on the team that's really familiar with navigating the nuances of your student information system. And then we also know it's incredibly important to have a district perspective involved in your team. And I know Amy will talk more about that in a little bit, but having that district representative can really help make sure that you have some broader school-wide trends that people are paying attention to in terms of really being able to provide ongoing support. And like any team, you're going to want to make sure that we've established appropriate roles and responsibilities for people so that as they're joining the team, they know what's expected of them and that we can make sure that they have the space and time to meet those expectations. So while this seems pretty obvious in terms of information, if you were to pause and think about your own experiences of being on a team, you might have had the experience of being on a team and not being really sure about what your role is or what you bring to the team and why you were asked to be on the team. So really making sure that you have the correct people that can give you this information in a way that makes a lot of sense so that people can really be focused and connected to the topic at hand, which for this team is going to be focusing on early warning systems. Closely related to that is making sure that there are routines and space for the routines to happen. One of the things that we often do when we're working with different districts and schools on early warning systems is really making sure that there's an established meeting schedule. And with that is also an established meeting expectation in terms of what happens during meetings and really having that information determined so that people know what's going to happen in these meetings, what are the expectations if people are supposed to bring information, so really know what the schedule is over the course of the year so we know when the team is meeting, but also the expectation and the schedule of really how I come to the team prepared and what that means when we're having a team meeting focused on early warning systems. We also know that it's incredibly important to have these communication processes established. And so those communication processes can be important for people within the early warning system team. So it's very likely that some of the work that people are doing on early warning systems will take place out of the team meeting. So then what are the appropriate ways to communicate within the team members and within the team? And then this notion, too, of having two-way communication so that you're able, the early warning system team is able to collect information from the rest of the staff as well as to share information out to other staff members who might not be on the team. We know this is incredibly important. And we know that nothing that we've just shared about setting and establishing these teams is really earth-shattering, but we also know that it's important to take the time to make sure that those processes and those routines are established and are communicated, as well as making sure that you have the right people on your team. So we always pay attention and really focus on that as one of the first things that you're going to do if you're learning around early warning systems and really interested in getting going on early warning systems. So this next section that I'm going to be talking about is this combination of indicators and reports. So what does this mean? Well, when we think about the indicators portion, we want to make sure that we're using valid indicators, that we have information about what those are, and I'll go through some of the general research really quickly on that. But then this notion, too, of having reports, right? We want to make sure that the information that's provided in the reports is actionable, is usable, but that we're also paying attention to some of this notion, important notion of privacy, right? We want to make sure that the appropriate information is disseminated out to people, but that we're not giving out information that we shouldn't. And so really making sure that we have useful information and appropriate information that protects student privacy. So I'm first going to talk about some of these indicators. And so research has been done across the country focused on early warning indicators, and we've been able to identify through the research that these following that are up on the slide indicators are really commonly used indicators for early warning systems. And these early warning indicators that are commonly used include attendance, course performance, particularly at the high school level, the number of Fs, grade point average, disciplinary incidents, and let me go back a little bit to the number of Fs. That's also important in middle schools as well, but in a slightly different way. And so we know that these are the common indicators, and what's great is this is all readily available data that you have at your school. As we think about using these indicators, though, and what we do in terms of making actionable information and decisions, we also know that these indicators are symptoms. They are not causes. But what we can do is we can use these indicators and using appropriate valid thresholds of these indicators to really help us then identify what students are at risk and how we can then make sure that they're getting appropriate supports. So what this means in terms of some of the reports, the indicators, keeping with the indicators, this is information that's been collected in research that was done in Chicago, and this is information on number of days absent. And you can see that the students that were absent 0 to 4 days had a higher percentage of graduation in 4 years. And that's what these tables are showing you. As you look at from the left, going to the right, you'll see a pretty steep drop-off in terms of the students in the percentage of those students that graduated between missing 5 to 9 days to 10 to 14 days. And that's why that new arrow line is there, because that's going to show you where that threshold tends to be for attendance. We have similar graphs for semester course failures, and this is for any course failure for 9th grade. There's a pretty significant drop-off between failing one class or not failing any classes. Then we have this reverse in terms of GPA. So the higher your GPA is, the more likely students are graduating. And so we'll see that there's a pretty decent drop-off around 2.0. And then this is a summary slide. I know I went through the research really quickly, but this is where we can say, okay, here are the common thresholds using those indicators, in terms of where students are going to be and how students are going to be identified about whether they're not at risk for graduating high school. And so this information is in a lot of different research reports. We can spend a full, probably day just going in depth on those, but we like grounding our conversations in the research and what the research says around indicators, as well as what those thresholds are for when a student is at risk or not at risk. So how this then translates in terms of some system, some sort of tool is going to give you information about if a student is off or on track. And this is a sample of a student report, and anywhere where there is, so just to give a brief awareness of this, all of the rows at the bottom, those are individual students, and anywhere that there's a red, that means a student has been identified as being at risk for that particular indicator. So you want to have student level reports, and then you also want to make sure that you have school level reports where you can then see trends across the school. And in this report, this is for a group of students for a particular trimester. This report will show you what students, how many students that were missing data, how many students are not flagged, which is the black, and the blue, that very top aspect, is the number of students who are flagged. So there's a lot of different types of reports that you can get as you're using an early warning system. But you want to make sure that whatever tool you're using gives you both the student as well as the school level report. And so Amy is going to kind of make this a little bit more concrete and talk a little bit about, in her experience, of making sure that she had the right team in place to really help move their early warning system work forward. So Amy, go ahead.
Thank you, Jenny, and hello, everyone. Again, my name is Amy Szymanski, and I'm a consultant with the State Support Team Region 1, which is in Northwest Ohio, near Toledo. So if any of you are familiar with that area, we just got a lot of snow, not as much as Indiana, but thank you very much for joining us today. As Jenny said, it's really, really important to ensure that you have the right people on your team. We really want to look at a comprehensive team, a diverse team, and one of the key members, a key consideration when building that team is to secure district-level team membership. It's definitely understood that district personnel are busy, totally understanding of that. But it's important to include district personnel in a team in some capacity. Consistently participating would be an ideal situation, but at a minimum, we would recommend, or I would recommend based on my experience, that district-level personnel would be represented and participate on the team at the end of each grading period, at least. Because from my experience, district participation really brings a level of credibility to the work. It provides that affirmation that the work of the team is really important and it's valued. And the team members feel like they're a part of something very important, which they are, and it really does highlight that. District personnel are also really at a unique position to synthesize the student and school level data. You saw those reports that Jenny had shown on the other side, or slides. They can review those data, synthesize that information, and then identify district-wide needs. And this really increases the potential for that systemic, sustainable change, which can impact large groups of students, and ultimately really prevents that potential for risk to surface in the first place, if we can really get to that root cause. So I've done a lot of work with many different schools, and I actually saw the power of district participation with the first EWS team I ever supported. And it occurred in the team's first year of implementation, right after the first grading period of the school year. And in this situation, the team was looking at their school building level reports, and they noticed right away that a large number of students were flagged, meaning they had failed one or more courses. They looked more closely and discovered that the majority of those students who were failing were in the 9th grade. They dug even deeper, and they identified that almost all of those students were failing biology. So the team started to think about, why would this be? Why would they be failing this course more consistently than all of the others at that grade level? They noticed the failures weren't teacher-specific. They were not student-specific. The teachers and those that were on the building level administration were kind of stumped. But fortunately, there was a district curriculum director on the team. And when he looked at the data, he said, you know, I think the reason for this course failure could very well be due to the rigor of the biology. And when I think more about it, we just started a new math curriculum, and maybe those biology concepts coupled with this new math may just be too difficult for the students to manage successfully. So he kind of brought a really unique perspective that the other members hadn't even considered. They thought about it then as a team, but weren't really sure where to go next because, of course, they could start to tutor those kids, but was that really going to get to the root? So again, building from that district level type of position, the curriculum director was able to almost immediately suggest that they were going to switch their science classes. They decided that they were going to pull their 9th grade biology class and switch it with their 10th grade physical science class. And, you know, not only did he suggest it, but he actually followed through with that, made sure that it occurred. They were on a block schedule so they could make those changes a little more quickly. But had it not been, you know, for that curriculum director's participation, I'm pretty sure that we wouldn't have seen, first of all, what that trend was, understood how to address it fully, and then to actually see it through to fruition. So, you know, I guess that story just really emphasizes to me how we want to make the time to really include the right people, and if at all possibilities, have that be a district representative.
Great. Thanks, Amy. This is Jenny again, and we've got a couple of questions that have come in, and so we want to pause and answer those. There was one question that asked about how Fs are slightly different in the middle school levels. So in 9th grade, it's a course failure in any course. It doesn't matter. That will trigger a student as being at risk. Research has shown that that will trigger a student for being at risk for not graduating high school. In middle school, so 6th, 7th, 8th grade, it's a course failure for English language arts or mathematics. Those two key subject areas are where students, if they get an F, make them at risk for not graduating high school. And let's see here. We have another question that came in about what middle school indicators, oh, the slide just moved on me. What middle school indicators exist in terms of identifying students who are at risk for not graduating high school. There was information on that slide that gives that summary, and we'll also post a link to a publication that Sarah mentioned earlier on that has some summary information on the indicators and the thresholds specific for middle school and what we know about those indicators. So you can do a little bit more reading there. Another question is, what strategies should one use if no significant trends or patterns can be identified in the flagged students? Amy, do you want to answer that question?
Sure, I would be very happy to do that. You know, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that there really isn't a silver bullet type of strategy. We oftentimes have to try and hope that we have dug as deeply as we can to the root cause of why the students are at risk to start to identify what types of strategies are going to work best for their identified needs. So in terms of, you know, if there aren't any patterns or trends, you really may want to break down the data in a variety of different ways. So I know we'll talk about some of those database strategies, or I'm sorry, decision-making strategies a little later on. But I would just try to make sure that you have dug really deeply into why those students are at risk, and maybe some patterns and trends would emerge as you look more deeply into the data.
Great, thanks, Amy. There was another question on who on site would typically play the role managing and analyzing the data. Is it a teacher? Is it a school counselor? Amy and I have probably, and the others on this call too, have probably seen examples of any and all of those options. That really plays into your school and local context in terms of who might have the expertise in it, as well as the time set aside for it, as well as the appropriate person to really champion that work. Some places it could be a counselor. I've seen it be actually a math teacher before. I've seen it be a school psychologist. It really depends. There's often not always a role that is a data person in schools. Some schools are really fortunate and have that, but not all do. So it really just depends on the local context about how that might happen. And then there's another question about so teams sound important, but how can we implement early warning systems with low school capacity and no common planning time? Amy, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, I would say that is a pretty common type of situation that we've experienced as we supported schools too, and I know that I can see that Denise might be typing some possible responses as well. And I would say look at what you're already doing and see how you can embed the practices into your currently formed teams. I was noticing a question about, is there a place for teacher PLC teams to be using the data? Absolutely. Look for teams that are already operating in some regard and then try to look at how you can kind of infuse the EWS data into that. Or you may be kind of getting to a point where you'll start to revise some of the current teams that you have and transform them into an EWS team. I've seen that happen as well. It's just kind of a matter of first assessing what you have and trying to work from there. You may also decide that you might want to break up your work into smaller groups, and I'll give an example about that in a little while on how you might want to do that. A school had a similar situation that I'll describe in a couple moments.
Great, and that's a perfect transition time. So we're going to keep going so that we can give an overview of the remaining areas. And with that, I'm going to introduce Sarah Frazelle, who is a Senior Advisor at Education Northwest. She serves as the lead for the Montana Data Use Alliance at REL Northwest and has also led previous REL Northwest work on early warning system implementation in Montana, Oregon, and Washington. In addition, she co-authored Practitioner's Guide to Implementing Early Warning Systems, an EWS implementation guide, which was developed for the Institute of Education Sciences, which is what we're using today as our framework to really have this discussion. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Ginny. I really appreciate that. Well, now let's go ahead and turn our focus toward linking indicators with interventions. There's four components of linking, component four is mapping interventions to indicators. And with it, there's several steps to begin to do that process. Step one is to start to think about how interventions could be thought of differently across the district. Some people might just consider programs such as Check and Connect as an intervention, or they might consider people such as a school counselor to be an intervention. Or some places might even consider resources such as a clothing closet. While a clothing closet may not seem like an intervention, one school that I was working with considered it one because after talking to some chronically absent students, they realized that these students weren't coming because they didn't have clean clothes. So they organized the initiative to set up a clothing closet and called it an intervention. The important thing here is to decide among your group and across the levels what you're going to define as an intervention first. Step two is to identify all of the available interventions. Which departments or groups are providing interventions currently? Like Amy was talking about, we want to leverage what we have available already. Some common places to start asking are your student support services, special education groups, college and career readiness groups. Your PBIS or RTI teams are another good place to start looking for what the available interventions are. The third step is to identify the objective of each one of those interventions. In the early warning system team meetings, you can start to discuss how each intervention is designed to support students. What's the goal of them? They may not be mutually exclusive. For example, assigning a mentor to a student might help them improve in all of the indicators such as attendance, behavior, and course grades, whereas an automated calling system might be more appropriate for just addressing attendance and would be focused on the attendance indicator. I'm sure we're all familiar with the tiered approach to provide interventions, but as a reminder, we do talk about a tiered system when we're thinking about providing interventions to students. As a reminder, the tiered triangle it has intensive interventions, which are reserved for one-on-one support or small groups. A targeted intervention, which is aimed at more at the 10 to 15% student population, which would be maybe an after-school tutoring group or something like this. And the big one to never forget about is the universal or school-wide interventions that we have going on. And these are the ones that would affect every student. So like in Amy's story, when they started to really dig down into into who was failing, and they started to realize that it was biology, they switched the framework of the classes, and that started to get to help more students at that group level. And so this is an important thing to remember as we're starting to think about cataloging interventions, because the next step is to be able to identify that intervention tier for each one of those interventions. And then finally, being able to identify the capacity and the ownership of each of the interventions. We want to be able to know how many students can be supported, and we also want someone in the school to be able to look at, to be able to take ownership for that. After being able to look at all of these 5 steps, you should be able to fill out an intervention catalog such as this. By cataloging interventions by the indicators, capacity, tiers, schools, and districts can begin to quickly identify gaps in their system while also developing a list of where to place struggling students according to their need. We do have a spreadsheet of this type of tool that I believe Kinwin is putting in the chat box, so you can download that if you're interested. But after filling that out, we need to be able to look at what gaps exist in student services and interventions, and what could we add or change to further improve student support. Now that you've got your catalog, it's time to think systematically about the supports by looking at the supply and demand. By creating that map of interventions, which includes the student capacity of each intervention, we can look at the difference between what the school or district has available versus how many students were flagged. We can then use these numbers to see if supply equals demand. For example, if 100 students are flagged for attendance and current attendance interventions could only support 60 of those students, adjustments might need to be made. Using the catalog of interventions, divided up by indicator, begin to tally up how many of your students your current system can support. More than likely, you'll find gaps in supports, or perhaps too many intensive interventions and not enough school-wide interventions. If you are having gaps, think about your community. Are there additional organizations who are already providing after-school programs? Many times, these programs are open to suggestions on how to best support students. Another place to look at is grant opportunities. From transforming classrooms to implementing a Bring Your Own Device program, many times grant opportunities exist to assist in creating new programs. Get Ed Funding is a free grant finding resource that uses searchable databases of current grant and award opportunities to help schools streamline the process of finding funds. Next, it's time to assess how many students we need to support. Sometimes that's easiest to see through a trend analysis. What % of your students are sliding off track? What % are extremely off track? Now, looking back at your catalog, can you support all of your struggling students? The student voice is often overlooked when we're considering interventions, but it's important to include them in the process. Consider forming focus groups with students to gather their ideas about why students may be missing school, acting up, or failing classes. One strategy is to use students who are already struggling to identify some root causes. Secretary Arnie Duncan, pictured here, has been inviting students to engage in conversations on issues they are confronted with, such as gun violence and Native youth in foster care. Student groups can also be informative in helping design culturally responsive interventions. A school in Montana organized a student-led group of Native students to help increase engagement and attendance for that particular group. And now at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Amy so that she can share another one of her practitioner stories.
Thanks, Sarah. You know, as you're all listening, you may be thinking, wow, this is great, but well, how will we ever find time, and how aren't we going to exhaust the little amount of human and fiscal resources that we have? And I think Sarah really hit it on the head when she said we need to consider what we currently have, those current initiatives and those current interventions. We have to make sure that we are not making this work just one more thing or constantly reinventing the wheel. There's got to be a strategic plan that really helps you identify how those interventions are going to be assigned, provided, monitored. And if you have a plan, then your work is going to become more efficient and then ultimately more effective. So, in my experience, the teams really needed to focus on, wherever they were, starting at that point, and then putting forth a conscious effort to really identify, review, and revise their current initiatives and intervention, in addition to maybe creating some new ones. So you might find that a few data-driven tweaks to a current practice might really be all that's needed to obtain a better matched student intervention than what was currently available. And you have built a team that has a great amount of expertise, and that's where their hard work and their knowledge can come into play. So, never underestimate the power of what your team can come up with, given sometimes small amounts of resource. One of the teams that I had worked with started in that capacity. They didn't have a really large team, but they knew that they wanted to do something universally for all of their students. So they started a student success hour where all students had an opportunity to come and receive some extra tutoring if they wanted. That had started prior to the early warning system work that I was doing with them. Once they started to look at their school level reports, though, as a part of the early warning systems, they realized, they were actually really on track with identifying where their greatest area of risk was within their school, and that was course failures. They had a large number of kids that weren't passing classes. So right away they were able to say, yeah, you know what, our data is showing us that something that we currently have in place is good. But you know what, it's not good enough, because when we looked more closely then at their student level data, we found that some of those students had more than one course failure. And so given that data, they decided they wanted to build in some small group tutoring right within that larger group opportunity. And then they looked even more closely at students who had more course failure on their risk profile, and decided that those kids would have individualized tutoring in addition to the small group instruction. So by taking a really large universal type of intervention, they then built in their targeted intervention based on the number of course failures, and then those kids that had even more intensive need built in some individual student level tutoring opportunities, and also some mentorship and things like that. But I think the key here, takeaway, is that start with what you have and really then, build those supports from that. It'll make things, I think, a lot more smooth. And then, create new things as the data supports. Another example would be in terms of organizing your team structure. Maybe you can't meet all the time with all of the people from your team. So one of the teams I worked with, and very well maybe on this call, if so, you'll know who you are, they decided that they would organize their actual team by tiers. So they had a group that was more, familiar with the universal and more, policy kinds of opportunities for the school. So that was one piece of their team. The second was more of a targeted intervention piece of the team. And then the third was a much more individualized kind of wraparound team. They met consistently as their tiered teams, but then they also then met, maybe once every quarter to relook at the data as a collective team to make sure there was fluid movement back and forth between, the levels of intervention. But that was a way that they were able to provide those supports, monitor those supports, and not necessarily hold every single person on the team accountable for all of the information and all of the work. So just a couple more ways to consider what you have and how you can be as efficient and effective as possible.
Thank you for that story, Amy. That's really interesting. I always find it interesting to hear how these kinds of early warning systems are being used in the field. At this point, let's turn to the last section, which is evaluating interventions. This last section covers the importance of recording information on interventions, such as which students attend each intervention, how often they participate, and their beginning and ending student performance scores, so that we can look at trends of student progress in the individual interventions over time. This requires conversations and agreement after reviewing the data. Sometimes this is hard because we tend to marry our interventions, and separation is hard. Think now in your EWS groups about how long it should take before seeing results from an intervention. These conversations will run smoother in the future if you can discuss these things up front and add or delete interventions based on the trends at the end. A simple way to track students school-wide is by looking at changes in the number of students who have been flagged in each indicator. The goal is obviously to decrease the number of flagged students, but you should also check to see if this trend holds for every group of students. Now, I did see a question from Elaine that was saying that we need to be careful about not identifying students or making sure that we're not targeting certain student groups. But we do want to make sure that we have the available interventions to support all of the different student groups. And so by being able to look at the number of flagged students by the student subgroup, you can start to check to see if the trend holds true for every group of students, if we're supporting every group of students, such as boys or girls, grade levels, ethnicity, ELL status, special education status, etc. This can help you identify if there are additional supports that certain groups of students may need. You will need to keep track of some data on each intervention. First, ask yourself, does the intervention fit within the need of the school? If so, then have upfront conversations that are documented about what regular participation would look like. How would you measure the progress of the student? And if a student regularly participated, when would you expect to see enough progress that they could stop attending the intervention? Because we don't want to just put students in interventions and have them sit there forever. Finally, you need to take a step back, and in general, what would a success look like if the intervention did work? Let's define that up front in the early warning system groups with every intervention, and then we need to see if all the students that are in the intervention are improving. Finally, we want to keep track of student participation and their data so that we can look over time to see if students who did participate regularly, like we had all defined, are improving compared to students who didn't improve or who didn't participate. At this point, we're going to go ahead and reopen this up for questions. Let's see. What strategies have been used to garner total school buy-in and the use of EWS is the first question. Jenny, would you like to answer this one?
Sure. I've seen a lot of schools actually use data to really kind of help take some of that personal aspect out of the conversation that might be hindering some of this work. It's really hard to argue with data that suggests that a large number of your students might be off track or at risk of not graduating. So data seems to be one way that people have had a lot of success in really starting those conversations. It's also kind of figuring out what else is, how this work might kind of supplement or connect to other areas of work. I've worked in some middle and high schools that were already doing some sort of multi-tiered framework and system of support, and this work really helped kind of add another aspect and another facet that they felt what they were doing currently was lacking. So those are two quick ways, and we'll see if people have other follow-ups to that, but we'll start with that.
Thank you, Jenny. I appreciate that. We are going to leave a little bit of time. We want to be able to leave a little bit of time at the very end for some questions. But at this point, we have one more practitioner that's going to share her journey with her school district. This is Denise Wright, and she's the Student Services Supervisor for the Centennial School District in Portland, Oregon. Denise has worked at Centennial School District since 1997 as a learning specialist, student services consultant, and student services supervisor. She currently works with the K-12 staff members who are developing and implementing multi-tiered systems of support. This work includes early warning systems. She also provides training and supervision for special education staff across the district. Denise has a bachelor's degree in social and behavioral sciences from Linfield College and a master's degree in special education from Portland State University. And at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Denise.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your busy days to become informed about early warning systems. So the Centennial School District is a medium-sized school district of approximately 6,500 students in outer southeast Portland, Oregon. Our student population is very diverse economically, culturally, racially, and linguistically. As a district, when we chose to embed our early warning system work within our multi-tiered systems of support, instead of creating something new, something different, something in addition to for staff or buildings, and that was really important for our superintendent when we started this. And prior to really digging into this work, our district graduation rate was not where we wanted it. It was in the low 60s. And so we had a real impetus to get this work going and to put some systems in place to increase graduation for all students. Our district has really followed the steps that have been outlined previously by Sarah and Amy and Jenny, and through a lot of technical support that was provided by the REL Northwest. So I encourage any of you in districts or in buildings who are considering taking this work on to really connect with your REL to support you throughout this, because it makes a really big difference to have a broader network of support while you're doing this. So you can see, as I'm going through this, there'll be outlines of specifically the work that we have taken on. So just as they had talked about earlier, the first step that we did was to gather a team together. We initially had a district-level team that comprised of a variety of members. They were all focused at the secondary level. When we first found out about this work, we really thought we wanted to focus at the secondary because of that direct relationship to graduation rate. But as we discovered more information, as we took information back to our whole district administration team, the elementary principals had shared that they recognize the impact that can start as early as kindergarten, and so they wanted to be represented on our district team as well. So we were able to add members there. And then as our district team became more aware of early warning systems and provided support, we were then able to work with teams to determine where they would fit this work in at the building level. And so you can see last year we did a training with building team members who comprised specific members from the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 levels of support within a building, so that they had key members at the building level who were well informed about these practices as well. We also then, as our district team was in the midst of this work, looked at the indicators, and we reviewed the research that was provided by the REL. We did our own research. We thought about what was happening within our own district, and we initially went with the national indicators around attendance, behavior, and credits and grades. In a minute, I'll show you how that translates for our district specifically. And we set initial thresholds. We knew on the onset that we wanted to start with an initial number, and then once we got data and numbers and we started using this information, that it might change, which in fact it did. And so last year, we have indicators that we use for attendance and behavior that are the same from kindergarten through 12th grade. We do have specific credit and grade differences for our middle school and high school students. As was spoken about earlier, there are reasons why we would look at something different for middle school and high school. And on this chart, you can see we have the attendance and behavior indicators for the whole entire district. And then for CHS, that is our high school, and you can see the course failures that we're looking at to determine, is the student on track? Are they sliding? Are they off track? The bottom for grades is our middle school. And then at the very bottom where it says DRA and all school right, at the elementary level, we were using screening tools, and the DRA is a diagnostic reading assessment. We had a school-wide screening system that was in place, and so instead of using grades or credits, we used that to indicate if students were off track in one of those areas. We're revamping that whole system, and so going into next year, we'll have another indicator that will help support us to determine which elementary students are falling off track in that area. We then, after we built our team and determined our indicators, we really spent a lot of time trying to develop the capacity to pull data and run reports. And this is where we reached out to surrounding districts. We looked at national tools that were in place. We leaned on our educational service district for a lot of information. And we also would develop something, and then we would share it with our specific team and administrators. While we were doing this work, we definitely recognized a hole that we had in our system because we did not have a specific data analyst or someone at the district level who was very skilled in this. And so through the work of that year, we were able to build a case and have evidence of why we needed to hire a data analyst. And so last year when that happened, that changed a lot of things for us, because then we had a liaison between our educational service district and our student information system that could help then build the reports. And once we were able to build reports through Excel spreadsheets, then we were able to start using them at the building level. So we would build a report, I would take it out and work with a high school team, and we would run through scenarios and look at students and sort students by race and ethnicity, or we would sort students by grade level. And we would find glitches in our system. We'd have to go back and fine-tune that. And so throughout that, we were able to develop something that is in the works now. We use it K-12. Our middle school is able to use it at the team level as well as the building level. Our elementaries use it a few times a year to look at big global groups of students. And this is a quick snapshot of what a version of one of our reports look like. You can see that students are indicated in the areas of behavior, attendance, and credits, whether they are on track, sliding, or off track. We can prioritize that so that the top of the list shows students that might be off track in all three areas, so that a team can really determine that that student needs interventions quickly and may need an array of interventions. This is also where we can, again, sort if there's a pattern we see in a grade level, if there's a pattern that we start to see based on race and ethnicity. We're using the same indicators for all students, but it does allow us to then sort. So if we do have students who speak a second language and we want to see how are they doing with attendance or how are things going with behavior, we can look at that. We can also look to see if we find a group of, say, in one building we had a high number of Latino students who were off track in attendance. That really made the team think about, okay, so how do we communicate with the families in native language? Is there some information that we need to be sharing about the importance of school attendance that maybe we have missed or assumed that families were getting that could be more culturally responsive both to the students and to their families? We also, from that report, can then develop charts that teams can look at, and so we can have point-in-time data as well as looking at comparison data. It's exciting that we've had our same report from last year to this year. Our high school team just at the beginning of the February was able to look at the point in time last year where all students were with attendance, behavior, and credit and where they are now. And so we were able to gauge the success of some interventions that had been in place and to really look at where we're seeing positive impact of the work. And so it also allowed teams to focus on where they might want to work in the future. Throughout this, again, our district-wide team and then building teams have been doing the work of mapping those specific interventions. And so as a whole district group, we looked at mapping initially at the elementary, middle, and high school in all three indicators, attendance, behavior, and grades and credits. And then after we had that work, our specific team at the high school then reviewed the list that was high school specific, and then they started to sort out some things that weren't actually interventions or some things that maybe weren't in place anymore. And then we also noticed of all the areas, we had the least amount of interventions in the area of attendance, and that was actually where our highest need was as a building. We had the most at-risk students in that area. And so again, through partnerships with community members and within the building, we were able to designate that as a priority and increase attendance supports and interventions for this school year. So that has been a significant change based on looking at data and looking at the interventions. And this is a snapshot from that tool that they're using. You can see the intervention name, the contact person. We didn't fill in the student capacity, but that's a piece that's important to see, and then which layer of support students would be getting those interventions at. And so for some of you, after listening to all this information that we've shared over the course of almost the last hour, you might be wondering, is there an impact? Because this might feel like a lot of work. And for us in our district, we have definitely seen positive gains. And we also recognize that our early warning system work isn't the only work at play to help support increases. We have a significant emphasis on culturally responsive practices and awareness for our staff that's impacting this work. We have positive behavior support systems that are in place, K-12. We are looking at our professional learning communities and reviewing data. And so there's lots of elements that are outside of this work that also lend and support. And so from this you can see within the last few years our graduation rate has increased to over 70%, 73%. Our credit attainment is rising, and this was looking at our specific ninth graders and where they were a few years ago and where they were last year. Our discipline has had significant declines, and we also have specific district-wide goals around these areas that our superintendent has laid out. And then many of these areas are goals that we're looking at as a part of a state. We have achievement compacts, and so this work fits in with work that we're measured by the state as well. And so sixth grade attendance is one of those specific places that we look for where our students making gains. And we are seeing a higher rate of sixth graders attending at this time. And so as a district, we recognize that while we are following the steps of the early warning systems work, we definitely have more specific work that we need to do on looking at the success of our interventions. This is an area where often staff and buildings are asking for more, and part of the work that we're doing is asking for people to really focus in on the quality of the intervention and being able to be very specific to identify what the intervention is focusing on. And throughout that work, and again, partnered with the work throughout our district, we plan to continue this work and plan to see increases for students as well. So thank you very much. And I'll pass this off to Sarah.
It's always wonderful to hear your story. I know you guys have been working on this really hard for several years at this point. So at this point, I do want to open up it. I know we only have about 4 minutes left, but I do want to answer a few questions and put them out to some of our presenters. One of the first questions that we are going to address is there was a question about whether parents have been invited to join teams and how this information can be used to communicate with parents. I know that that's one of, when I was looking at that national research on who's on the team, on these teams typically, it does suggest that there has been a lot of success with inviting parents to the teams themselves so that they can represent their students and try to talk about kind of what those root causes would be. So I think that if you have a rotating parent group or something like that, then adding those people to your team might be beneficial. And I know that there's one other district also that has been using the actual student-level early warning system reports with the parents to be able to talk to them, even as young as kindergarten, of just, you know, attendance, behavior, and course grade, they're important, and your student is off track a little bit in here, and it's just this conversation piece that they can have with the parent to be able to educate the parents on those important factors about school success. The next question that we have is for Denise. And there was someone wondering if the data analyst that you hired was an independent consultant or whether they were hired for your district.
We hired a specific person for our district, and he wears many hats. And so he manages our student information system, and he's able to merge reports. And so he's able to work with multiple different agencies and groups and then develops the reports. And then I actually help filter and sort and get those out to teams.
Excellent. Thank you. Jenny, and probably some input from Amy and Denise. This one's for you. What sorts of options are early warning system technology, software, et cetera? What types of software are available out there, and how would that be integrated with the student information system? Jenny, do you want to kind of give some of your experience in that first?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's a question that has a lot of follow-up questions in terms of really getting clarity. And the second part of that, in terms of integration with the student information system that you're using, will really help you kind of figure out the ease of getting information from a student information system into an early warning system tool. There's a lot of different options out there. I think one of the things as you're exploring your options is going to be clear about kind of associated resources required for it to work, whether it's human capacity in terms of exporting information from your student information system and then uploading that information into an early warning system tool, which is typically what we've seen across the nation, knowing that there are so many different student information systems out there that it's really hard to create a specific tool that can kind of do a seamless transition from student information to an early warning system tool. So really getting clarity around kind of what information you can get out of your student information system, what kind of, what the data looks like when you get it from your student information system, like what's the output, and is that output easily then become the input for an early warning system tool? There are a lot of different organizations out there that have fee-for-service early warning system tools, and so that there are a lot of them out there. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Right. Thank you, Ginny. And I know that some states have early warning system tools available. I've been working with the state of Montana, and they have a system that's available to all of the districts in the state. At this point, I do want to be mindful of time, and I want to put up the survey link so that you can provide us some feedback on how we were doing and what other questions you might have. I know that we have a lot of questions. We had over 360 people register for this event, and so we had a lot of questions. I know that we did not get to all of them, but here is the survey, and if you could take that time and give us some feedback on what you want to see next, that would be great. I really appreciate everybody joining in, and if you have any specific questions for us, our emails are right here at the bottom, and you will get an invitation or an email soon about more events that are coming up and also the archive of this webinar. So I thank you.